Hello, I'm Desire 500 on a very windy day, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Only one president in American history has ever received a PhD, and he's actually the only one to serve as president of a university. That'd be Woodrow Wilson. He served as president of Princeton University and got his PhD there, I assume. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 23rd President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison, is known for one thing. Well, probably anyways, if he's known for anything, and that's serving in between Grover Cleveland's terms. However, as president, he didn't want to be president. In fact, he often cut his days short at noon because he wanted to spend more time with his parents and grandkids, or no, not his parents, his kids and his grandkids who lived at the White House with him. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. As president in 1868, to be specific, Andrew Johnson was acquitted of impeachment by one vote in the United States Senate. It was the first impeachment trial of a president, actually. But anyways, so he gets off in the Senate, and then later, the next decade, well, not later, it was in the next decade, he tries to go back to the Senate. And he does, actually, in 1875, just before he dies. So, Andrew Johnson is the only president to go back to the Senate after serving as president. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The sixth president of the United States, John Quincy Adams, barely had a retirement. It was only 2 years long. However, his post-presidency lasted longer. It was about roughly 19 to 18 years. Well, technically it was 18 years, almost 19. But most of that was actually spent in the House. He went to the House after he was president. He's the only president to go back to being a representative after serving as president. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. During the Great Depression back in 1929, the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, decided that the best way to make a lot of money back was to put a bunch of tariffs on a bunch of American allies. Following this, American allies put reciprocal tariffs back on the United States and made, well, the Great Depression, the biggest economic depression in history. I think that's happening right now. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 29th President of the United States, Warren Harding, was an infamous adulterer. In fact, he wrote many letters to his mistress, where he used the name Jerry as a code name for his... Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. It was only about 200 years ago that the first dinosaur was discovered and named. That'd be the Megalosaurus, meaning great lizard, back in 1824. That means George Washington, who died on the 14th of December, 1799, never got to experience dinosaurs. That's a very sad thing. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Only twice in American history has the First Lady been the sister of the president. Back in 1881, when Chester Arthur became president, his wife died in 1880, so his sister became the First Lady. And right after he left, in 1885, when Grover Cleveland was a bachelor at the time, before getting married the year later. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Gerald Ford, who was the 38th president of the United States, was elected president without being elected at all. Although that does sound a little weird. He was elected to the House in one of Michigan's districts and was appointed Speaker of the House. A newly passed constitutional amendment, which was probably voted in favor of by Gerald Ford, allowed Richard Nixon, whose Vice President Spiro Agnew had resigned, allowed him to put Ford on as his new Vice President. And then later, in 1974, in August, Richard Nixon became the only president to resign, making the Vice President the president because of that. So Gerald Ford became president despite not being elected president nor vice president, and he's the only one to have done this. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. non-consecutive term, President Grover Cleveland served non-consecutive terms. And in his second non-consecutive term, he was afraid that him having surgery, because he needed to get surgery because there was something wrong in the lump of his mouth. So there was something in his mouth and he needed surgery to get rid of it. He was scared that saying, hey, there's something in my mouth, I gotta go get surgery, it would shake the stock market very much, to the point where it would be not good. So he had a private surgery aboard a yacht, and nobody knew about this surgery for quite a few years before the doctors finally broke their silence the next century. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 19th President Rutherford B. Hayes spent most of his time with genealogy. In fact, he considered it his number one pastime activity. He would spend hours after hours after hours studying his own genealogy and the family tree of other people that he knew. He also met with a lot of distant cousins because he was so fascinated by it. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. When William Henry Harrison was elected president, supporter of his opponent, Martin Van Buren, who had also served as president, complained that Harrison was too old, weak, and feeble to serve in the position so high as President of the United States. He was elected at 67 years old. He was the oldest serving president until Ronald Reagan 140 years later. We've now just had 3 elections electing the oldest president ever elected. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 18th president, before he became such, was a very, very good Civil War general. But on the day of April 9th, 1865, Ulysses Grant had a horrible headache. He described it as a sick headache, which later turned out to be a migraine. In fact, he noted that it did not dissipate when using mustard paste, because that's how they got rid of them back in those days. But it went right away after he learned that Robert E. Lee planned on surrendering. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. It is the 160th anniversary of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. However, he wasn't actually shot on the 15th, he was shot on the 14th. It took about 9 hours of straight unconsciousness by the president for it to eventually kill him, while his successor, Andrew Johnson, was reportedly roaming around Abraham Lincoln's bedside saying, "They will pay for this." However, as president, didn't really seem like he did. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Most people know now that Theodore Roosevelt was shot at a campaign speech and managed to finish it before actually seeking any medical help. However, not very many people know that why he was shot was because he was vice president to this guy called William McKinley, who himself was shot dead in 1901. Now, it's 1912, and there's this guy who gets a dream from William McKinley's ghost that says it was actually Roosevelt who killed McKinley. So that's a very interesting plot for a movie. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Third President Thomas Jefferson was a known inventor, and he invented a lot of things that you probably use on the daily. One of those includes the swivel chair. Yes, it's true. The third president of the United States was the known inventor of the swivel chair. Or at least, maybe not the inventor, but he definitely made it more, he changed it a little bit to make it more like a swivel chair. Like, he didn't invent the idea, but he definitely made it like the way you think of a swivel chair right now. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. When the Whig Party fell, most of their members became Republicans. Take Abraham Lincoln, for example. He was a Whig and became the very first Republican president. However, one of the most infamous Whigs at the end of the Whig Party was Millard Fillmore, who served as the 13th president. And instead of becoming a Republican, he actually became a Democrat instead, the main rival of the Republican Party. Hello, I'm Desire 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. When no one was willing to defend them after the Boston Massacre, which killed about 5 people, John Adams, the second president of the United States, but back then was just a lawyer, decided to take up the cases of the British soldiers who had carried out most of the killings of American citizens Why did Adams do this? Well, not because he believed the British were right or that he loved the British more than the Americans, but because he believed the British soldiers deserved a fair and free trial. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Herbert Hoover, who was the president before Franklin Roosevelt, actually met with Adolf Hitler, so it's crazy. So Herbert Hoover met with Hitler, and his successor defeated Hitler. Well, I mean, not really, because he died before the surrender of Germany, but you know what I mean. Hoover actually, as you may think, did not actually think Hitler was a good guy. He denounced the Nazis for what they were doing, but he did think that the United States should stay out of European involvement. Now, that might seem like a wild thing to suggest, but back then it was a pretty normal thing to suggest. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Only 2 American presidents have identified as Roman Catholic. The first being way back in the 1960s with John F. Kennedy, and Joe Biden was the second one. Although there were other Catholic candidates. Take Al Smith back in 1928, who lost for a bunch of different reasons. Maybe because he was a Democrat running against a Republican after the Republicans were very popular, but also he eventually went on to be the main designer of the Empire State Building. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Back when John Quincy Adams was serving as president, it was rumored that Marquis de Lafayette gave John Quincy Adams an alligator to roam around the White House, although that story may not be true. What is true is that if you fast forward 100 years, Herbert Hoover was in the White House, and he had, he didn't have an alligator, but he had sons who had an alligator who lived at the White House. So, we're due for one very soon. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 7th president, Andrew Jackson, was known for being very short-tempered, right? He got into a lot of duels. And I mean a lot. In 1804, I want to say, he went up with a guy called Charles Dickinson, who insulted Jackson's wife. Jackson then proceeded to shoot him in the chest and kill him. Well, Dickinson shot Jackson first, but Jackson didn't even seem fazed. He just raised his pistol and killed Dickinson like it was nothing. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. James Monroe, who would eventually go on to be the 5th president of the United States, fought in the Battle of Trenton. And the Battle of Trenton is notable because a lot of British people were killed in the Revolutionary War in that battle, but there were no American deaths. There was just one American injury, James Monroe. He was actually very, very fatally wounded, but he actually survived and went on to serve as president, of course. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 12th president of the United States, and the only president of the Confederate States, shares a relation. Zachary Taylor's daughter, I think Sarah Taylor, or Margaret Taylor, one of them, dated Jefferson Davis and actually got married, but Zachary Taylor's daughter died of cholera when the Davises went down to New Orleans. So Jefferson Davis for a time was the son-in-law of a United States president, but also general. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Before, we talked about how Abraham Lincoln was a very notable wrestler and actually is in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. But another president who's in the Wrestling Hall of Fame is George Washington. I don't know if he was a good wrestler per se, or he was just inducted because he was such a very influential figure, but he is in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. I guess he was pretty strong. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today is Ulysses S. Grant's 203rd birthday, so I thought it'd be a great idea to talk about him for the presidential fact. He's the president on the highest denomination of American money, the $50 bill, and he's been that way since 1914. I know what you're gonna say, well, the $100 bill is, well, a real thing, so why am I saying it's on the highest denominated bill for a president? Well, that's because Benjamin Franklin's on the 100, and he's not a president. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today is James Monroe's 267th birthday, so I thought it would make a lot of sense to make today's presidential fact about the founding father. You see, everyone knows that the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., is named after first President George Washington. However, there's also a capital city named after James Monroe, and that's in the city of Monrovia, which is the capital of the country of Liberia, located in Africa. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. While the 17th president, Andrew Johnson, can definitely be argued that he is the worst president in American history, the one thing about him that cannot be argued is that he wasn't a patriot. Andrew Johnson loved the United States. In fact, he loved the United States of America so much that when he died, he decided not to be buried in a coffin, as most people are. He decided to be buried wrapped in an American flag with a copy of the Constitution. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 30th President Calvin Coolidge, before he was such, was the 29th Vice President of the United States under Warren Harding. And President Harding actually let Calvin Coolidge into these cabinet meetings, although Coolidge offered nothing and remained silent most of the time. But however, when Coolidge became president, he did not let his vice president, Charles Dawes, on any of the cabinet meetings that often.